Now, I've been the managing director for the Whale and Dolphin Conservation Society in Germany and Central Europe, but I've become an independent consultant. I had to do something new. So my agency is called Shifting Values, and I'll explain you why.
Thank you. És akkor megkérném, hogy tartsa meg az előadását, ami az utolsó lesz az ebédszünet előtt.
Thanks. I have a little bit of a difficult starting point, I guess, because after we're moving to the lunch break, so I hope you can keep up a little bit more. And I've absolutely no idea. I'm a very bad time manager, so it can be quick, it can be long. I will try to stick to the point. And I move a little bit backwards to the more towards the presentation Paula has given, as I come from the perspective of international wildlife conservation or protection. And basically it started all in Budapest for me. 20 years ago, exactly 20 years ago, I came to Margaret Island when 5 dolphins had been imported. They were former military dolphins. And I was a young activist. I had long hair, so after 20 years it's all gone. And in that time when I arrived as a young activist, 2 were already dead. I had no idea about dolphins, but from that moment on, I stick to the issue, to marine issues. And for 20 years now, what has changed is that the dolphinarium was closed with a very passionate Hungarian, civil servant called Katalin Rodic. She's just one of the most passionate wildlife activists in Europe and has been in power for, I think, to the last government, or the new government came in power. So she, I think, left to Greenpeace.
Yesterday she was here.
Oh, excellent. She's just brilliant. And there's no dolphinarium in Hungary. Hungary joined the International Whaling Commission, and here is, I think, a very good starting point, because Hungary is an inland, and Austria is an inland. And I felt always that this is kind of, I'm not sure if it's the reason, but it's a kind of a moral reflection of taking up the voice for animals where you have absolutely nothing to do with, because they don't belong to coastal states. And here is, I think, where the question all started, what Paula was giving. Are there animals that have intrinsic rights themselves? I give a presentation today together with my colleague Margit Prideaux, who I closely work with, and she says hi, but she lives in Australia, and that's a bit too far. And it starts all with the recognition that the science today is so much advanced in our knowledge about whales and dolphins. For example, the orca. The orca is recognized probably not as one species, but as a species complex, because it evolved so many different cultures and diverse behavior and social complexity that it's still recognized one species where you can prove that the sustainable paradigm, which we believe is employed in international conventions, is failing, and it cannot achieve to protect those animals if we want to protect culture and social complexity. So let's go back to where it started, or basically it started much, much earlier. But I think when you talk about international conventions and the legal framework of how to protect wildlife, of course the Stockholm Declaration is one of the key, let's say, starting points in their definition. And I don't want to bore you, I need to keep time short, but I do think still we need to read those principles which are talking about the natural resources of the earth, including air, water, land, and especially representative samples of natural ecosystems, must be safeguarded for the benefit of present and future flora and fauna generations through careful planning or management as appropriate. Man has a special responsibility to safeguard and wisely manage the heritage of wildlife and its habitat, which are now gravely imperiled by a combination of adverse factors. Nature conservation, including wildlife, must therefore receive importance in planning for economic development. That very, very clearly has been the principle which was leading to the development of many institutions and conventions in the past 40 years, and those ideas which are always from the interest of the Homo sapiens to do something for its own benefit. And we believe had some very, very significant impacts to how we deal and how we relate to animals, and in my context here, to wildlife. That concept has been then advanced over the years, and I just want to give you one more definition, and I hope to stop soon with definitions. And that's also where the NGO power comes in play, from WWF and IUCN, but also lining up with UNEP in the World Conservation Strategy, when they defined what sustainable use or sustainable development means. And it is the modification of the biosphere and the application of human, physical, living and non-living resources to satisfy human needs and improve the quality of human life, taking account of social and ecological factors as well as economic ones, of the living and non-living resources base, and of the long-term as well as the short-term advantages of alternative actions. And you see, we only talk about resources here. We left the language from an animal or a living being or whatever, and we put this into the context of an economic benefit, an economic value to us. This approach, when you look at and I'm just stressing 4 conventions which relate to wildlife conservation, the overarching institution of the UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Programme, then the development of development of the CITES agreement, which deals with the international trade of endangered species in the early 70s, the Convention on Migratory Species, which deals with species that migrate, transboundary migrate, so elephants or whales and dolphins are a very good example of migratory birds, or the Convention on Biological Diversity 1992 in Rio. But all those conventions are set around the principle to preserve species from extinction or prevent extinction. So they list animals in categories, which means it's about you calculate animals in numbers, you put them then into different categories, and I will give you then examples during my presentation. And based on those categories, you set the protection or conservation measures. To explain this easier, the more you are endangered or the less animals there are around from a species, the better is your protection status. And after 20 years now working in international fora, I think that's one of the most fundamental mistakes the international community has done, because it will never ever be successful in protecting wildlife with that approach. I'm convinced about that fact. What are the consequences? A tree became wood, a gorilla became a tourist attraction, a tuna became fisheries biomass, and a dolphin becomes an entertainer, and you can prolong this as long as you wish. We moved away from recognizing how we relate to the individual. The animal has moved to a resource or a calculated economic capital. The rights of an individual is not mentioned or addressed almost anywhere there are in the international convention framework. Okay, CITES. Give you now 3 examples. I want to talk very briefly about CITES, the convention that deals with international trade in endangered species. Very briefly about the IUCN categories, and very briefly about the situation of a very close species to us in the Mediterranean, the common dolphin, reflecting our thesis that the sustainable paradigm must fade. CITES, you have animal species or plant species listed in 2 appendices. And Appendix 1 lists those species threatened with extinction and therefore trade needs to be strongly regulated. So the primary commercial use or trade in these species is prevented. But we still have found exemptions for certain reasons that the Homo sapiens is allowed to continue trading animals under certain circumstances. And what I mean, or what I want to point out here is that how, for example, you obtain an animal from the wild, what the impact is of removing that animal towards the group almost doesn't matter from the individual perspective. It has absolutely no relevance. It only matters if you impact negatively on the long-term survival of the species or the population. Okay, so, for example, this is a bottlenose dolphin. It's in Appendix 2, where you are allowed to trade under certain circumstances. And in Japan, as you probably know, the amusement park industry removes dolphins, and when they capture a large group and they take the young females or the young calves to bring into captivity as an entertainer for international trade, the rest is slaughtered. But that doesn't have any meaning to CITES, because first, that animal doesn't enter trade, and secondly, judged by the authorities, it's not detrimental to the survival of the species. Because bottlenose dolphins you will find in very large amounts in numbers. But that convention does not deal with how they live in social groups, that they probably in coastal waters exist out of 130 animals per group. That is no relevance to this international convention, so the impact is on the individual is not recognized and not addressed. When you look at the international discussions about the status of species, you will always come to the red list. The red list is a category and a very sound, strong, a scientific-based knowledge about the abundance of species in its global scale. So they set up categories of how threatened a species on a global scale is. So it's a kind of an index. So the categories are, you can be categorized as a species under extinct, that means you're gone. Critically endangered, I come to that. Endangered, vulnerable, threatened, least concern, whatever. So we always put species on their abundance in categories. It's not about their behavior, how special they are. We heard about sophisticated intelligence, how complex they live. It's about numbers. And then we look at the numbers. And critically endangered, for example, and really forget the numbers, but just to stress them, you need to scientifically demonstrate that there are certain kind of declines, like 90% of decline within 10 years or within 3 generations, etc., or less than 250 reproductive major animals around. Then you fit the category, and then you might become into a category that grants you better protection compared to others. So you are a resource that can be used and utilized as long as you're there in numbers. Once you're not there, you get a good status. You're then critically endangered. And that concept, I think, totally contradicts the spirit of conservation and protection, and probably invites, and I show you an example now, even to deal with species in a way that you move them towards extinction. The endangered status, again, don't look at the details. It's different mathematical categories. The number of reproductive animals is then 2,500 less, etc., etc. So they're very complicated, very sound scientific categories, but you just look at which animal species fit into which category. Important is that from international organizations and governments, funding for scientific research and conservation is predominantly given for species that are in critically endangered or endangered status. So again, you do not start with protecting a species which is abundant and flourishing and probably in a good status and habitat. You start the more they are threatened and then vulnerable. That's, I think, irrelevant. So let's look at the polar bear. It's a very charismatic species. It goes through the media. It is becoming the symbol of climate change. So the polar bear is vulnerable. at the current IUCN category. We calculated to 20 to 24,000 specimen, and we know that they live in 19 subpopulations. However, all scientific prognoses, which are sound and based on the latest information, claim that those relating to the ice age, for reaching their feeding areas, etc., will be disappearing within 45 years, and those living on the mainland are extinct within the 40% likelihood within 100 years. So what I try to say is that the polar bear will just walk through the different categories. It is vulnerable, then it will be endangered, and we know that, and then it will be critically endangered, and we also know that. But what it means I'll give you a scientific example in a published journal. A scientist he had the balls to report about an individual experience of a female polar bear in 2008, swimming, I think, almost 700 kilometers within 9 days, and then had a walk of 1,800 kilometers to reach her feeding grounds. She lost 20% of weight, and she lost her calf, or a cub with polar bears. And I think if we forget about talking about the animal and what it might mean to them, and just talk about resources and how much percentage we can harvest of those for trophy hunting or other reasons, I think we will fail in protecting those species, and especially when it becomes more complex and we threaten the habitat of where we probably might really fail to create a situation for the polar bear to not become extinct. Another example, do I have more minutes? A few more? Okay, I go. Sorry for the lunch. Another example is the common dolphin. And to me, it's a very good example because in its name, the name of that species is common dolphin because it's so common. That species is one of the most abundant species in the world. And in protection categories, it was least concern, but now with more information coming, we categorized it as data deficient because the scientists were unsecure about the numbers. But in some regions, scientists have very good knowledge and very good data, for example, in the Mediterranean. So when you look from the global perspective now to the regional perspective, what is the situation? Okay, we have it classified as endangered. This is the distribution of the common dolphin. Many centuries ago, it was common everywhere in the Mediterranean, spotted, seen, and abundant. This is the present situation of the common dolphin. It disappeared from the eastern part of the Mediterranean. We have fragmented, very, very tiny social groups in the Ionian Sea left, and towards the western part of the Mediterranean, in numbers they are larger. And this is why they are just endangered and not critically endangered. The common dolphin in the northern Adriatic vanished, it's extinct. So we have exterminated many, many social groups, populations, regional populations, they are gone forever. We are driving the common dolphin towards extinction in the eastern Ionian Sea. And in the western Mediterranean, we classify the common dolphin still as in large numbers, but in unsustainable takes, which means at the moment the bycatch is about, for fisheries, about 10% of the population. It's quite a dramatic situation. So again here, the situation reflects that the common dolphin will walk through one state of the other category, but the political concept totally fails to protect neither the individual, nor the social group, nor the regional population. So we believe that the failure done is that we built the conventions and legal framework on a wrong paradigm. So that leads, of course, to the question whether do we really need to judge every living being by its economic value? Or are there some species beyond use? And I here really support Paolo's theory and thesis put forward that we have to start with animal groups where we have lots of knowledge which are convincing, and that does not preclude to set up the rights or to recognize the individual right of those animals from other animals. It's the starting point where we believe it has to be proclaimed within international conventions. So the conclusion is, we believe that the sustainability concept for wildlife conservation, and I'm talking about wildlife conservation, it had failed. It significantly failed. It does not meet the objective to protect an individual. The individual is not existing in international conventions, almost non-existing. And we call on for a new approach within international conventions and law. And one example is the referenced Declaration for the Rights of Whales and Dolphins. And I just want to end with a provocative statement. Paolo mentioned it very clearly that the moratorium on whaling, on large whales, we just talk about the big, large whales, is a moratorium on commercial whaling. And there are other whaling activities which are still happening and not within the legal framework punished. And when you think about Aboriginal subsistence whaling or indigenous whaling, it always has a prejudice, or at least from my side as well, in my heart, I would have sympathy for it. And I can just invite you, after 20 years of experience, not one single indigenous group has condemned commercial whaling in the International Whaling Commission. The Greenlandic indigenous communities go whale hunting on call by supermarkets and luxury hotels. And what I'm stressing here is not to condemn their right to whale in a situation where probably some groups don't have resources to eat on, but I invite you to question situations case by case to make up your opinion and take it from there. I just hope that I could give you some kind of ideas. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. We have time for 2 or 3 questions, and after we will have a lunch break. So there is one question here, but maybe first somebody who didn't speak with one.
I've been speaking a whole day yesterday.
Yeah, it was yesterday.
But let me say to Nikki, there is a more profound problem in everything environmental, and that is that all concepts that exist today and are being used to teach or manage environment are flawed. They are seriously flawed because the economics behind them is flawed, because ethics behind them is flawed, because science behind them is terribly flawed. And unless and until we start to appreciate the limits of economics, science, we will not be able to change our ethical behavior. And problem is ethical, and we have created a jungle of these. I wrote the first textbook in America on international environmental law. I dealt with all of them. And they're all useless. None of them solve problems, they create new problems. And that's when I started talking about a different thing, the ethical, economic, and scientific dilemmas of the principles of environmental management or law, which is a different topic to be addressed. But unless we correct those 3, which is very difficult, and most of the economic things in that I rely and take from Amartya Sen's publications like Discipline of Cost-Benefit Analysis, Creation of Fake Markets, and trading in things in those trade markets. The biggest example is climate change and trading of carbon, and missing the actual objective, what we need to do in order to preserve the nature.
Thanks, Sudhir. And I'm familiar with your publications, and you know that I've the deepest.
That one is not published yet.
No, but you have published a lot.
I have sitting on it for last
Okay.
15 years.
Okay.
I'm sitting on it for 15 years.
Okay. What I cannot and I will not and I don't want to say is that I have the solution or the way I'm thinking is the way forward. And I think that was the speakers before you really reflected or could recognize that there are different approaches. What I do want to do is, and when you think about, let's think about for 1 minute about Rio Plus 20. You know that Rio Plus 20 is the biggest environmental conference since 20 years. It has been moved to 3 weeks later to the original date, which was planned for 2 years. Why? Because it's the Queen's anniversary in the UK. Where have been the NGOs to articulate that in the public? Nowhere. The big two issues at Rio Plus 20 are structural reform of UNEP and the green economy issue. Where is the statement from NGOs? You know, I'm criticizing my own environment, so to speak. But I think what is important with the Declaration for the World Rights, the Declaration for Whales and Dolphins' Rights, etc., and also the pragmatic approaches, the important thing is to articulate visions. If we lose out and just fall the trap to play the game of the multinational companies, you know, if we only concentrate on we fight back in changing that language or whatever, I think we miss out because the public is, I think, quite educated and aware and passionate for a change. So the point I'm making is here, we need vision and different concepts, not one concept, different concepts to believe in a change. Whether it works or not, I think is a secondary matter because what we should not do is to have the different models fight each other. I think that's quite important.
Gabor, please ask a very short question.
Nicolas,
After a short answer and after we have a lunch break because we will be late for the afternoon. Thank
you developed a great argument for fundamental rights to animals and living beings. Because the only way to give up this way of thinking and treating them as stocks is to recognize that they are individuals. Subjective rights. Without this, we will continue on killing them, and that's all. So it's a great, great argument with huge scientific evidence and experience behind, and we should. I hope you would agree that it's a great argument for world rights and fundamental rights for living beings.
It is. It absolutely is. And my last bit is, I'm not sure if you like T.C. Boyle, but he's an American author and has just published a new book called When the Killing's Done. And in that book, an animal rights person fights with a conservationist, and it presents the situation of NGOs, which spend lots of time to fight each other, who has the right concept. But at the end of the day, I think visionary concepts of declarations for world rights or the pragmatic approach for, as you've given before, are both complementary rather than to fight concepts and waste time. Thank you.